Ever since the US started using its military might to threaten Venezuela, Russia has attempted to flex its muscles. Russian air defenses have already arrived in Venezuela, and there are suggestions that hypersonic missiles may be next. Vladimir Putin is trying to communicate to Donald Trump that Russia is just as strong as the US. The world's two major military powers are flexing their muscles, and the US just showed Russia that America's muscles are bigger. A US B-52 bomber has just humiliated Russia during a powerful show of force where it worked alongside its NATO allies to bring American firepower closer to Russia's doorstep. On November 13th, United 24 media reported that the US flexed its air power by deploying a B-52 bomber to take part in practice strike runs conducted far too close to Russia for Putin's comfort. The outlet says that the B-52 took part in a training mission that started in eastern Finland, which is only separated from Russia by the Gulf of Finland, which feeds into the Baltic Sea. The American bomber took part in a simulated strike while in Finland before flying into Estonian airspace. There, the B-52 flew to around 50 kilometers or about 31 miles away from the border that Estonia shares with Russia. We mentioned that Putin is trying to send a message to the US with Russia's actions in Venezuela. This was America's reply. The US B-52 was taking part in a multinational exercise that involved Finland, Estonia, and several other NATO members. During its time flying over Finland, the B-52 was also accompanied by Finnish FA-18 Hornet fighter jets. Though owned by Finland, these jets are made in the United States, meaning that the NATO exercise was an even grander display of the firepower the US could bring to bear on Russia than it appears at first glance. Together with its fighter jet escort, the B-52 simulated weapons drops on targets on Finland's Sotimpuro firing range. Russia would have likely had eyes on what NATO was doing over Finland, and it would have seen the American bomber pulling off its strikes, much as it's been doing for the decades that it's been part of the US military. Army Recognition provides more details in its report on the NATO exercise. It says that the B-52 that the US deployed flew from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana by way of Spain's Morón Air Base to reach Finland. After completing its practice run in Finland, the US bomber was joined by several UK-owned Eurofighter Typhoons, along with an E-3A Sentry early warning and control aircraft, showcasing that this was more than a display of US air superiority. It was NATO adding to the message that the US was sending by showcasing how its members are still able to work together, despite the many efforts that Putin has made in 2025 to pull Trump away from America's NATO allies. That's humiliating enough for Russia's president. He's already dealing with Trump having turned his back on Russia, as the implementation of sanctions against two of Russia's oil giants in late October shows. Now the US is sending weapons that Putin knows could do serious damage right to Russia's doorstep. And there's nothing that Putin can do about it without sparking a massive international incident. Army Recognition adds that the US wasn't just trying to flex its aerial muscles with this B-52 display. There are plenty of reasons why the US sent its bomber to Finland, both on the tactical and strategic levels. Starting with tactics, the outlet points out that so many different aircraft being involved in the joint NATO operation near Russia's borders shows us how the organization would likely organize a future airstrike against an enemy like Russia. The B-52 is the heavy hitter, of course, as it can carry a range of standoff munitions and precision-guided weapons. Having it flanked by fighter jets is also part of the tactic. The Finnish Hornets, for instance, can carry air-to-air missiles along with ground weapons. The tactic becomes clear. The B-52 drops the bombs, and the Hornets or the Typhoons protect the plane during its journey. Army Recognition also notes that Finland's Hornets are equipped with the Link 16 data links. Used throughout NATO, Link 16 is a communication system that allows any aircraft or piece of equipment hooked up to its network to transmit and receive real-time tactical data. In other words, the US B-52 sees what the Hornets see and vice versa, ensuring that all of the aircraft involved in a NATO strike have as much situational awareness as possible. Link 16 is a literal lifesaver, as BAE Systems claims in its explanation of the system. Link 16 is the standard by which other systems are measured for secure, airborne situational awareness. In fact, Link 16 has been credited by the US Air Force as a key factor for saving lives in multiple theaters due to the increased situational awareness the system provides, the company claims. So NATO's November training exercise wasn't just about testing its aircraft. It also focused on ensuring that those aircraft can communicate when undertaking operations. Assessment was clearly on NATO's mind, and that assessment stretched beyond the communication system used. Army Recognition says that the Finnish fighter jets that escorted the American B-52 also allow the Finnish Air Force to practice different weapons effects, timelines, and radio procedures they might not be fully familiar with. Again, NATO needs to know that all of these moving parts can work in tandem just in case it ever needs to launch strikes against Russia from Finnish territory. So Timpero was also a good choice for the operation's practice range, as it's technologically advanced enough to provide data on weapons timing and footprints, even in exercises where live ordnance isn't used. That's another slap in Putin's face. The US doesn't even need to physically drop bombs from its B-52s to show Russia that its aircraft are capable of hitting their targets. Across the board, the exercise allowed NATO allies ranging from Spain and the UK to Finland and Estonia to practice running combined sorties. The presence of Allied bombers in Finnish airspace also gives national command authorities and air defense C2 structures an opportunity to test real-time battle management across borders, from Muron through NATO's Combined Air Operations Centres, CAOCs in Torrejon and Bodo down to national control and reporting centres, Army Recognition adds. Then there's the strategic side of the whole affair. It's here where we start to see why Putin is both so angry and humiliated by the US sending one of its B-52s to Finland. Since September, Russian aerial assets have made several unauthorized incursions into NATO-aligned airspace. These incursions started in earnest when around 20 Russian drones entered Polish airspace in early September, which forced Poland to scramble fighter jets to take the most threatening of those drones out. Russia didn't stop there. A few days later, a trio of the country's MiG-31 fighter jets entered Estonian airspace, where they lingered for 12 minutes, ignoring all requests to communicate. Again, NATO aircraft had to be scrambled to escort the Russian jets away. That event marked at least the third Russian incursion into NATO airspace in September alone. There have been many more since. Belgium has had to temporarily shut down several of its airports due to drones being spotted in their vicinity, Reuters reported on November 5th. There have also been sightings of drones, most likely Russian, near several air bases in the country. Unidentified drones are also flying over military facilities in the Czech Republic, and they disrupted air traffic at 6 of Denmark's airports in September alone. Airports in Germany have also suspended operations due to drone sightings, while Lithuania has dealt with strange military balloons entering its airspace, which have also led to airport closures. Russia denies that it's involved in these incursions, which European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has described as acts of hybrid warfare that are intended to sow division throughout Europe. However, there's only one country that has an axe to grind with NATO and access to the types of drones and fighter jets that are making these incursions. Russia has spent the past few months both testing NATO and trying to showcase that it has the aerial might to cause major problems for the group's European members. Perhaps Putin thought that Europe alone would be left to deal with all of Russia's drones and jets. That isn't the case. The arrival of B-52s in Finland shows us that the US is prepared to back its European allies with some of its best aircraft. Army Recognition makes that point when covering what the recent NATO training exercise means from the strategic perspective. It says that the main purpose of the exercise seems to be to send a clear signal to Putin that NATO has the ability to project credible firepower across the entire Euro-Atlantic space. That's important for the likes of Finland and Estonia. Both countries share borders with Russia, meaning they will be among the first in the firing line if a conflict ever sparked between NATO and Russia. By sending B-52s to take part in such a coordinated exercise now, the US is showing Putin that it can do the same again and that the tactic will work if NATO ever has to go from practicing its bombing runs to executing them on Russian territory. There's also an element of tit-for-tat involved in the deployment of the B-52s, as Army Recognition explains. NATO's decision to forward deploy B-52Hs to Spain for BTF Europe 26-1 is explicitly aimed at maintaining a flexible, theater-wide bomber presence that can respond to increased Russian military activity, including long-range bomber patrols by Tu-95MS and Tu-160 aircraft near Allied airspace, the outlet claims. Norway also has a role to play in all of this. CAOC Bodo is in Norway, and it was involved in the NATO exercise. That CAOC was only officially opened in October, so its inclusion in the NATO exercise shows that the organization is very capable of bringing even its newest assets to bear. NATO's posture on its eastern flank is evolving quickly, Army Recognition points out. The organization is trying to build an architecture that enables it to dominate key regions, including the Baltic Sea, Barents Sea, North Atlantic Ocean, and Scandinavia as a whole, and this exercise shows that these efforts are succeeding and are already highly coordinated. Again, that's terrible news for Putin. While he's prodding NATO with drones, NATO is responding by showing him the reality of what Russia will face if it tries to cause any real trouble on the eastern flank. The timing of this exercise isn't coincidental either. In the introduction to this video, we noted that the US and Russia are both involved in the storm of conflict that's brewing around Venezuela. That's just the latest in a series of back-and-forth incidents involving the two nations. We've already mentioned that the new sanctions that Trump levied against Russia in October, which saw the US president finally follow through on threats that he'd been making for a while, as his frustration over Putin's refusal to make peace discussions related to the Ukraine war seriously boiled over. Russia's response, modern diplomacy reports, is to conduct nuclear drills. The US may be gearing up to do the same. On October 30th, NPR reported that Trump has claimed that he wants the US to resume nuclear weapons testing. "We've halted many years ago, but with others doing testing, I think it's appropriate to do so," Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One. Adding Venezuela into the mix, you have Putin trying to use the country as a proxy to intimidate the US into doing what Russia wants. This may have been a misstep for Putin. There are reasons why Russia sending air defenses to Venezuela is a catastrophically stupid decision, and you can find out what they are if you watch our video covering the matter. But back to the B-52. It's clear at this point that the US and Russia are engaged in some sort of contest. When one nation flexes its military muscle, the other is responding with a flex of its own. The US allowing its B-52s to join NATO allies in an exercise on Russia's doorstep may be the biggest of these flexes that we've seen so far. Why? Well, it communicates to Putin that the US stands firmly with NATO, that its aerial assets are deployable at a moment's notice and as needed, and that the US understands the importance of NATO's eastern flank. What this deployment represents is something far more concrete than Putin thought he would see out of NATO, and especially out of the US. The exercises the B-52 and its NATO compatriots just conducted in Finland aren't symbolic. This isn't the US sending a bomber close to Russia just to show that it can. That bomber has been involved in exercises that could very well have real-life implications. Command relationships have been solidified, and the message has been sent that whatever aggression Putin may have planned in Eastern Europe, assuming that there is aggression at all, will face more than a local force. The drones Russia has been sending into European nations have been met with localized responses. If Putin pushes things further, the US will deploy long-range strike assets that can hit Russia on its own territory if needed. And then there's Finland. With so much focus being placed on the part that the US and its B-52 have just played in NATO's recent aerial exercise, it's easy to underestimate just how important Finland's involvement is. When Putin launched his Ukraine invasion, Finland was essentially neutral. Though it had a long and oftentimes torrid relationship with Russia, Finland seemed to be showing no signs of discarding that neutrality to join NATO. If anything, the relationship between Russia and Finland, at least from a trade perspective, was growing closer. As the Observatory of Economic Complexity reveals, exports from Finland to Russia rose from $190 million to $258 million between January 2021 and January 2022. The same period also saw Finland increase the amount it spent on Russian imports to $1.05 billion. The former represented a 35.4% increase over the previous year. Imports rose by 141%. They had been $434 million just a year before. We chose this period in Finland and Russia's trade relationship because it's right before Putin decided to invade Ukraine. That invasion changed everything. Very soon after Russia's forces entered Ukraine, Finland transformed from a nation that had a somewhat healthy relationship with Russia into one that was acutely aware of the possibility that Putin wouldn't stop at Ukraine if he won the war he started. On April 4, 2023, Finland went from neutral to NATO member, sending as clear a message as possible to Putin that it's willing to do whatever it takes to defend itself against his aggressive tactics. Finland brought with it a military that has an estimated wartime strength of 280,000 people, the BBC reports. It also has 900,000 reserves and trains 21,000 conscripts per year. But more importantly than that, Finland gave NATO an even stronger presence on Russia's doorstep, which is what the US has just used to humiliate Putin with its B-52 bomber deployment. Putin thought his Ukraine war would halt NATO's expansion. All it did was encourage countries that would otherwise have never joined become part of the organization. Since Finland joined NATO, it's wasted no time at all in making itself a key part of the defense collective. The country has been vocal about its intention to increase its defense spending, which would have ingratiated it with the Trump administration. Trump had himself been vocal about feeling that NATO's European members weren't paying their fair share, and had even suggested that the US help for NATO's other members might be conditional on them paying more when he was campaigning for his second presidential term. Finland is taking its spending commitments seriously. On April 1st, Breaking Defense reported that the Finns had pledged to increase their annual defense spending to 3% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, by 2029. This would have put Finland 1% over NATO's past recommendation that all of its members dedicate at least 2% of their GDPs to defense. NATO has since adjusted this recommendation to 5%, which is announced in June. Finland was again quick to respond, with the Helsinki Times reporting that the country aims to hit that 5% target of GDP by 2032. The key word here is commitment, and Finland has shown plenty of it. This latest NATO exercise, which has allowed the US to rub its B-52s in Putin's face, is yet another example of that commitment. As Army Recognition puts it, for Finland, the escort of the B-52 over Satimpuro underlines how rapidly it's transitioned from a military non-aligned nation to a frontline ally fully plugged into NATO's air defense ecosystem. You could even argue that the US is cooperating with Finland to deliver even more demonstrations of American aerial might. We mentioned earlier in the video that the fighter jets Finland sent to accompany America's B-52s were American-made Hornets. Those Hornets aren't going to be around for too much longer. Finland has agreed to purchase 64 F-35As from the US, the first of which moved out of its final assembly phase just over a week before the NATO exercise we discussed in this video. Perhaps that's the real point of this exercise. An American-owned B-52 arriving in Finland to conduct exercises on Russia's doorstep is a message for all of the reasons we've discussed. But behind that message is another being delivered to Putin on America's behalf by all of the country's NATO allies. Even if the US wasn't sending its own aircraft into NATO territory, it would still have a massive presence throughout Europe. Many of NATO's members operate US-made jets, and they do so because they know that these jets offer the best chance for them to deal with Russia's aerial assets, should they ever need to do so. Finland is soon going to have dozens of F-35s at its disposal. Those aircraft are well known to the US military because it was America that built them. If the November exercise was a showcase of how well the US, Finland, and other participants can work together right now, any future exercises will drill that point home as America ingratiates itself even deeper into NATO's eastern flank architecture. That's a show of force, if ever there was one. If NATO ever felt the need to strike Russia, it would have an easier time of it now than before Putin invaded Ukraine. Thanks to a combination of Ukraine's brave defense and Russia's poor management, Russia is more vulnerable to airstrikes than ever before. Russia's air defenses are already failing, and they're exposing weaknesses that Ukraine is exploiting right now and NATO might exploit in the future. Find out more in our video and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering NATO's latest exercises in Europe. And thank you for watching.